Good morning everyone and welcome to another video about Year 11 Economics, Area Study 2, Decision Making in Markets. Today, following on from what we talked about with the law of demand and the law of supply, we're going to be talking about market equilibriums, which is all about the price and quantity where demand and supply are equal. We're going to look at that first, what that looks like in a graph form, and then we're going to look at and talk about kind of the specifics of what happens when there are shifts or changes in the market, and how equilibriums can change. So getting onto that first slide, we shall be here. So I'm going to move my video away for a moment here, and we're going to talk about market equilibrium. So market equilibriums are the price and quantity where demand and supply are equal. So if you look at on any given demand and supply graph, there is going to be a point, as always. Love the beautifully straight lines this allows me to draw, but the equilibrium price is always going to be the point where demand and supply are equal. It's going to be the intersection between those two curves. So if you look at the we'll call them on the side here, equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. It's the price where those two are equal. So if the price is set above equilibrium, so let's just say, for example, we'll erase these. And if we set a price above the equilibrium price, we'll look at what happens. So let's say, for example, the equilibrium price is, let's say $2. Let's say it's for something relatively cheap, and the price is $2. There's a terrible dollar sign. If we set the price at $3, what's going to happen? I realize I'm asking this to a void. Hopefully you answered that to your phone, computer, or TV screen, and your family judged you for it. So if we look across here at $3, we are going to mark it across both the supply and demand curves, and we are going to see something very specific happen. So when the price increases, based on the law of supply, when price increases, quantity supplied increases. So you move up from that equilibrium point, and suddenly they want to supply a much higher quantity. Whereas it is the opposite for demand. So with demand, if the price increases to $3, as price increases, quantity demanded decreases, and therefore they are demanding less overall. And that leaves us with this area above the equilibrium point here. So if we look at this area above, and what do you call it when there is more supply than demand? We call that a surplus, or sometimes they call it an oversupply or glut. I've always found glut to be a really weird word, but I often like using it in my own answers because it's less letters and I find it's more efficient. And seeing as with economics we're talking about efficiency a lot of the time, I find it's really easy to use because of that. So whenever the price is set above the equilibrium price, it's going to lead to an oversupply or glut because supply outweighs demand. Because businesses start supplying a whole lot more because they are profit motivated, and this leads to there being too much supply and not enough demand. Then if we look at the opposite, we're going to talk about when the price is set below the equilibrium price. So if we were to have the exact same thing, so equilibrium price is $2, and then we set the price at $1, there is going to be the opposite occurring. So if we look at this, suddenly there is way more demand overall and way less quantity. And that's going to lead to what is called a shortage or undersupply. So this whole area under the equilibrium here is basically people want a whole lot of those goods and services, but there aren't enough left at the price that is currently being charged at. There have been a lot of shortages that we've seen in different markets quite recently, whether it be toilet paper, hand sanitizer, pasta, for example. We want to have cannelloni for dinner tonight, and you can't buy cannelloni tubes anywhere because people have apparently bought 1,000 years supply of cannelloni tubes, and we won't be able to have cannelloni again until stores can kind of get it back into stock. So this is a shortage or an undersupply, and that's going to occur when demand outweighs supply because the price is below the equilibrium price. So often in both these situations, regardless, so what normally happens in a shortage is if there is not enough of a good or service, consumers end up bidding up the price, which slowly rises the price higher and higher and higher until we reach the equilibrium point again. Whereas when we've got the opposite, if we were to redraw what it looked like for a surplus and we get back into this area above the equilibrium, when we're in this area, what tends to happen when there's too much stock? So we just had Easter. It was a weird Easter. We didn't get to go out a lot, but hopefully you still got some chocolate from your families. What happens on like the day after Easter? So like what happens on Easter Monday and Easter Tuesday with all the leftover stock of chocolate that is specifically like Easter branded, like Easter eggs, etc. It all gets heavily discounted. So that's because there's suddenly an oversupply of it, and businesses want to basically get rid of all of that stock before it goes bad. And so they start discounting it further and further until they find that new equilibrium that's been formed, and they can actually sell it at a price that it's going to be able to clear those stocks out. So where this gets a little bit more complicated is if we talk about how we reach new equilibriums. And it's not complicated from the fact of knowing what happens to the price and quantity. What's more complicated is how we get to that new price and quantity and talking about how we get there. And that's the thing that really differentiates the best students in a Year 12 exam from some of the weakest students in how they answer these questions, because all the stuff we're doing about supply and demand is going to be directly relevant next year if you do Year 12 economics, and therefore everything we're talking about now is going to be useful for you then. So reaching a new equilibrium. So let's say, random example, a pandemic hits the world. It's not something that happens that often. Coincidentally, based on this example, that's currently happening. So, and there's a ban on driving places unless it's for essential reasons. Essential reasons are for essential reasons at the moment, being, well, even then there's not for essential reasons to drive. It's basically the essential reasons to drive are you're going to work, you're buying groceries, or you've got a medical appointment. Exercise doesn't count. Exercise is meant to be from your front door. So don't drive somewhere to exercise. Pretty sure most of you shouldn't have your P's yet because you're in year 11, so you shouldn't be driving in general. This would cause an unfavorable shift in demand for petrol. So one important thing is to always work out what the market is for whatever you're talking about. This one I'll try to be a little bit, it's not cryptic, but it's a way you haven't been asked questions before. So when we look at this, it's talking all about driving. The market of what's being affected there is the market for petrol. Hopefully you've actually been looking around if you have gone out at all for essential reasons. I'm going to stress that a lot because I don't want you to be legally liable and getting a $1,600 fine. If you've been near a petrol station recently, petrol is the cheapest it has been in a ridiculously long time. It's below $1 a litre, which is insanely cheap. It makes me wish I had places to drive, but I'm also enjoying the savings I'm having in not having to buy petrol in the immediate term. So if this pandemic hits and people aren't allowed to drive places, this causes an unfavorable shift in the demand for petrol, as you can see drawn on the graph here. We've got that unfavorable shift, and what tends to happen is in the short term suppliers don't react to that change. So there is less demand at the same price at first. That may have been my worst dashed line of all time, so let's replace that with a better one. So at first there is a just reduction in demand at the same price, and so in the short term what's happening is people are demanding this quantity, which we'll mark here, Q1. That is not good either. And they're demanding that quantity, but this supply is still at that original equilibrium quantity supplied. So what's going to end up happening there is suppliers start to realize that there is an oversupply or a surplus, and they start decreasing prices until you reach a new equilibrium point where the price is a little bit lower and the quantity demanded is a little bit higher. And that's really, really important to be able to talk about. You've got to talk about that surplus that occurs first and then getting down to that new equilibrium point. And that's a part that people most often forget. Most often people talk about the fact there's an unfavorable shift, therefore there's a new lower equilibrium price and quantity. And although that's half correct, you've got to go through that full logical process. And the same can be true if we look in the other direction. So if we were to crudely draw a situation where a favorable change has occurred, we will do that now. So get rid of all these. So if we were to say the opposite, so if we looked at this and then we had the situation where let's say the pandemic ends and suddenly we can drive places again, the market for petrol there is going to be a favorable shift. So if we make this arrow go in the opposite direction, that would be true for that situation. So we'll look at D2 as being, or this original point here being our original equilibrium. When we have that favorable shift for being able to drive again after the pandemic is over, that is going to lead to a favorable shift in demand where all of a sudden more is being demanded at the same price. The issue with that being the original supply is much lower than the quantity demanded now, which causes a shortage. In a shortage, consumers then bid up prices to make sure that they are going to get that good or service, in this case petrol, until a new equilibrium is formed where the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied is equal. And so you've always got to go through these processes when talking about any shifts that occur and how you then get to a new equilibrium overall. So that's it for reaching new equilibrium. So if you are not from my class and you're watching this, this is all that's relevant to you. On this next slide, we're going to be briefly talking about, we did research into cryptocurrency, and that is going to come up on the assessment for this area of study as meeting our key skills through VCAR of doing research into a specific market and the supply and demand in that market. So you might want to watch that anyway, because you have nothing better to do with your time. So cryptocurrency markets. So if/when this comes up on your SAC, you'll be asked one of the following things. And by if or when, I mean it definitely will. There'll be one question about it and you'll have to answer it. That's me being very, very clear about it. So there's two kind of things that you'll get asked about. It's going to be supply and demand based. You'll get asked things like to evaluate how government intervention in the market could impact supply or demand. So how changes in legislation or regulating cryptocurrency markets could affect supply and demand, potentially just describing it in words or drawing a diagram to explain that. You might also get asked to discuss the impacts of global events on the supply or demand for the market. Also, the question will be super vague because the key skill in the study design is research and synthesize information about a particular market. You could talk about any market you want. You could talk about the labor market, you could talk about mining, anything along those lines, but it's probably easier to talk about cryptocurrency because you just did an assignment based on that and you should have all the information already. And just to give a quick summary or definition of cryptocurrency, if you've forgotten or your assignment was bad, a cryptocurrency is a digital currency in which encryption techniques are used to regulate the generation of units of currency and verify the transfer of funds, operating independently of a central bank. Decentralized cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin now provide an outlet for personal wealth that is beyond restriction and confiscation. So basically what it means is it's outside of the law. The government can't do anything about it for the most part unless they put in regulations, and therefore it can be used for a lot of nefarious or illegal uses because it can't be tracked, it can't be followed up as much as regular currency. If you have any questions about any of this, feel free to either comment below this post or send me a message. I hope this was helpful to you. I hope that all of these summary videos for this area study have been useful to you. Kind of enjoyed making them. So if you like them, I'm happy to keep doing them throughout the term. Anyone in my year 11 class, after we get through this, we are going to start working on a little bit of research around some of the current government changes that are occurring that are going to impact the economy. So all the different forms of stimulus they've been putting in place, because that's going to become incredibly important into your Year 12 studies next year. As always, thank you for watching. Make sure that you, if you're watching this on YouTube, can make a comment, like the video, whatever. I don't really care. I'm doing this mainly to help people and provide a service that helps people continue with their studies in this time of remote learning. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.